Welcome to the Erotic Realm podcast, where we explore the psychology of darker desires. I'm Em, and if you're new here, welcome. I'm a psychosexuality nerd with a background in psychology, sociology, medical science, and Tantra. I'm also in a 24/7 collared relationship, and I'm passionate about humanizing kinksters. Join me here for in-depth one-on-one conversations as we explore the fascinating world of eroticism, one erotic realm at a time. If you love what we're doing here in the erotic realm, I'd like to ask you a quick favor. Can you follow and rate the show on Spotify? It helps the show reach more people like you. And if you haven't yet, I'd love if you could subscribe to my Substack, Psychology of Desire. This is where I go even deeper into the science of symbolism, of desire, archetypes, and erotic evolution. You'll get access to articles, unique surveys and research, and behind-the-scenes access to everything we're building. Visit psychologyofdesire.substack.com. I'll see you there. And now for today's episode. The following conversation explores the erotic psychology of Biker Bear, a queer hedonist, dominant, and sadist from Melbourne's kink and swinger scenes. In this intimate episode, we dive deep into what healthy masculinity can look like in practice, how power and pleasure reinforce each other, and why kink is far more than a fleeting thrill. It's a lifestyle, a lens, and a liberating identity. Enjoy. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Erotic Realm podcast. Today, I'm very happy to have with me Bear. Welcome, Bear.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Good to have you. So we usually start the podcast with getting to know who you are outside of your sexuality, whether that be your general work area, if you're happy to share, or your hobbies, or both. What are you up to when you're not being a kinkster or exploring your sexuality?
I've got a couple of areas I kind of keep myself occupied with. So my username on FetLife and sort of my presence in the community is as Bear or as the Biker Bear. So I'm very passionate about my motorcycles and have been since I've been a teenager. I also just like getting out in the world and exploring as much as I can. I haven't had the opportunity to travel as much as I'd like, but I'm looking to rectify that soon. I've done a lot of traveling or touring around Australia on the bike and like to do some more of that as well.
Cool.
And then outside of that, I'll be a little bit broad with my work area, but I'm broadly in sort of the academic space. So I spend a lot of time delving into some parallel topics, perhaps to this. And it's really interesting, sort of when my kind of professional, my educational background intersects with my personal life. That's been an interesting journey and sometimes a confronting one.
Okay, fascinating. Are you able to share more about those topics, or would you like to keep that on the down low?
I would say that one of the things that I'm actively involved in at the moment, professionally, is looking into understanding gender perspectives on a variety of issues, particularly personal and political. And we can see that's also something of a topic around the world at the moment. And as a cis man, it's been an interesting sort of exploration for me personally as well to take some of those tools and turn them inward and to ask some sort of broader questions about my own identity. It's been very frustrating at times as well. I would say there's been a lot of sort of innate frustrations, and I've had sort of trying to work my way through these things, I suppose. That's about where I think I want to leave that.
Okay, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about it later if we can, but for now,
Yeah.
I want to dive into your sexuality. So how would you describe your sexuality, and what roles do you describe yourself as when it comes to your kinky sexuality?
So I think, and this has been particularly a deliberate focus of mine over the last 3 or 4 years to really think about this more carefully. I think the best way I can describe my sexuality is as queer. I have a broad range of attractions across different gendered lines. I have some same-sex attraction. I also am polyamorous and have been for most of in fact, I'd say I've been polyamorous all of my adult life. I only later on in life had a term for it, but I've never actually practiced monogamy in my adult life except in isolated, sort of specific relationship negotiations. It's not been my default state at all.
Mm.
Uh, and it's one of those things where I've been thinking about it. The conclusion I came up with was that basically I was never really like deliberately self-socialized into the sort of standard script of monogamy. And most people will go through this sort of early dating life, and it'll be the default script that they run to. You know how it goes. Most people, that's the way people date. They date one on one, and there's a more variety now. Although, traditionally it's been a hetero mononormative kind of environment. Everyone's either straight and dating one person, or they might be experimenting with different sexualities, or might be a different sexuality. But the sort of, there's a couple of like standard scripts that people follow, and I just don't think I got socialized into those in my dating life as a young adult. So I've never had a kind of monogamous bone in my body. I don't think I never got that imprinted onto me.
Hmm.
At the same time, I'm also practicing kinkster. Would be how I'd term that. I got involved in the BDSM community, the public BDSM community, again at about 18, 19. Very quickly, it became my night venues of choice, basically on a combination of a perception of safety, a perception of acceptance, uh, and it was the right kind of environment for me at the time. I was going to what I broadly describe as a kinky lounge bar, so there was some good music, but it wasn't dominating the space. There was lots of places to relax. There was a spa, and in that kind of community, I found a lot of acceptance, like I said, a lot of high level of perceived safety, a lot of community. So I
Mm.
never had the inclination to go out to any other kind of like standard nightclubs or even standard bars terribly often, unless I was going out for a specific drink with specific mates who weren't in that scene. So I've been in that community actively practicing in the public space on and off all of my adult life. In that space, I would say that I occupy a very hedonistically informed sadistic dominant role. So by that I mean my focus of what side of the whip, if you like, that I'm on is
Mhm.
almost exclusively dominant. I'm almost always the one holding it, with some interests in sensation and pain play particularly, but that it's all driven sort of from a mutual pleasure perspective. So I'm not as focused on high protocol. I noticed you had a guest very recently who was much more in that high protocol space.
Mhm.
I'm much more in the sort of, I'd say, more low to medium protocol space. I'm more interested in kind of the ebb and flow of power and play, and the ebb and flow of deliberate sensation, and particularly sadism, whether that's what I would call sadorsexualism, sort of playing in sort of more of the sexual overwhelm space, or denial, depending on the dynamic, or in the whips, chains, and leather goods, the
Mhm.
pain sensation space as well.
Oh, okay. There's a lot to unpack there. I have so many questions for you. You said you didn't grow up with a monogamous script. I'm curious to hear more about that. What script did you grow up with, and what did that look like for you?
I kind of had to write my own.
Mm.
So my family upbringing was quite privileged socially, I should say, in terms of the acceptance my parents had. Both of them, on one side, was very deliberately anarchical in their politics. The other side was very much in the arts scene,
Hmm.
particularly with writing and poetry. So I had parents that perhaps had a broader understanding of life and flexibility, I should say.
Right.
And then very early on, my first real adult relationship, so it would have been from when I was about 18 to 20, my then girlfriend and I had a couple of interactions fairly early on in our relationship where we were both kind of going, "Oh, wouldn't it be nice to do something with someone else?" And there was one party, and I think this was the first instance. It's going back a while now, but there was one
Hmm.
party. I think it was her birthday where there was someone she wanted to make out with or play with, and things went a little further than perhaps was necessarily negotiated. And she came back and told me about it. I'm like, "Oh, that sounds like fun." It didn't really occur to me to be upset or necessarily jealous about that. Like
Mm.
I didn't see any reason to. And once that, that relationship went on for a couple of years, as that teenage relationship, first serious relationships tend to, it sort of that kind of set a standard for me. I was like, well, didn't work out for other reasons, but it doesn't make much, like, there's no intrinsic sense to try and possess someone's romantic or sexual affection.
Hmm.
So, I didn't. I think it's been very much a process of experimentation. There's been lots of struggles here and there. I think in many ways I've had to write my own script in many ways, or as all good writers do, beg, borrow, and steal other people's bits and pieces and slap together your own.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think it was more that I didn't have that initial that initial baseline experience expectation wasn't put onto me by either family or early relationships.
Right.
So by the time that those conversations came up a little later on in my life, where people were more expecting that, I had a firmer idea that wasn't really how I wanted to do things. And there were some early
Hmm.
struggles. There was one relationship where that was a major tension. But generally, I'd say that the overwhelming majority of my relationships have been non-monogamous. And the one that really was pushing for it, that was one of the key fracture points, I think.
Mm. Okay, so that's your poly side. What about your dominant side? When did you start to explore that aspect of your sexuality?
Well, that was really interesting. So my first experience with with kink in general was a little. Well, I got no, no. My first experience with kink in general would have been early relationships where, you turned 18 and you can go out to a sex store and you're like, oh, what do these cute little restraint systems do? And we mess around with them a little bit. But I think my first proper experience of BDSM would have been when I attended a festival, and that was interstate, and there were representatives from the community at that festival from a different city, and I fell in with them because they were doing some really interesting workshops on consent and communication practice that sounded, to my 18-year-old brain like something I probably should know more about than I did. And
Hmm.
honestly, yes. Anyone who's met an 18-year-old boy knows those workshops are bloody useful for them.
Mm.
Uh, and so a few of us were going to those kinds of things a couple of times, and they said, "Oh, well, we're having a party tonight. Do you want to come along?" And so I went along to that, and that was my first kind of introduction to that space. I wound up actually in that moment, it's the only real time I've been in a more submissive space with one of the mistresses there, and that really opened my eyes to curiosity, I suppose. I didn't know where I was or what I wanted to do. It seemed like an amazing party. There was all sorts of people doing all sorts of weird and wonderful things, and I really wanted to be more involved in that scene. So when I got back home, I reached out to some friends who I thought might be in that community, and sure enough, a couple of them were, and they said, "Well, we're going out this Friday night. You should come to this particular bar at this particular time," and I did. From there, I found myself much more comfortable occupying the more dominant space. And since then, as these journeys all are, I mean, a teenage boy is not necessarily the kind of person most prepared to handle that kind of dynamic, but
Hmm.
through time and attention and practice, trying to deliberately develop skills, reaching out for mentors, and also finding oneself more comfortable in one's own skin. That's been a role I've sunk into more and more over time.
Mm, beautiful. You mentioned earlier about exploring yourself as a cis man. I'd love to go into that more. So, growing up, what messages did you receive about masculinity, and when did you start to question or redefine them?
I grew up primarily with my mother. My parents were split when I was about 9 or 10, and I don't think I really had particularly fully present male role models in many ways.
Mm,
I have a good relationship with my father, but it was a sort of a weekend visitation thing.
right.
Uh, and then by the time my stepfather came into my life, I was already a teenager and was fairly independent. So I wouldn't say my stepfather was terribly much of a sort of like a masculine or father role model in that way. So I don't think I really did think about it.
Mm.
That's not to say I didn't get the messaging. I think there was a lot of messaging I got sort of at a standard societal level, particularly around some early unrelated trauma about from an accident I was involved in, basically, where I got the sort of standard, men don't talk about their feelings, and it didn't seem quite right to me, but it also, I subconsciously found it hard to connect
Mm.
to discuss those things. So I think I got sort of like if you want, the standard Western script, but at a distance. It's only been in the last 5 or 6 years, I'd say, that I've actually thought of gender and masculinity as part of my identity quite deliberately.
Mm.
And that's partially come from some personal struggles where I've noticed that some of those things have been manifesting. The that standard, like, men don't talk about their feelings. Actually, I've got
Mhm.
some feelings and I want to talk about them. What does that mean? How am I going to go about doing that? Why don't I know how to do this?
Mm.
That those kinds of questionings become more and more prominent. The other thing is, as I said, I'm broadly in a space where I'm more connected to the sort of social and political discourse, as it were, professionally, but also, uh, in the current kind of cultural zeitgeist, particularly when you're involved in alternative communities, there is a real shift up, I think, in terms of what we're actually accepting in our standard societal scripts. And there's a lot of toxic elements to traditional conceptions of masculinity around power and control, particularly in relationships and particularly in heterosexual relationships, and men's control over women or attempts to control women,
Mhm.
that are rightfully changing. Where I think that becomes a bit tricky for me as a cis man, not as a heterosexual man, but as a cis man, is that there isn't a really good script of how, or a really good even guideline of how to be a good man. And I mean both of those in capital letters.
Mhm.
We've got a lot of discussions at the moment around the toxic elements of traditional masculinity, and very rightly so. We've got a lot of discussions from feminist scholarship, from active feminist advocates and movers and shakers in the fourth generation now or fourth wave of feminism that's sweeping through sort of our societal discourses. What's absent in this sort of gender studies space is a masculine articulation of a positive masculinity.
Mm.
And that, I think, is something that I'm trying to deliberately write and rewrite for myself at the moment. It's quite tricky though, because you don't have, this is the really pointy end of men don't talk about their feelings. It turns out even at a scholarly level, there's not a lot of literature on this.
Mm.
And a lot of the literature that's on it is focusing on the toxic elements of masculinity. And quite disturbingly, actually, some of the stuff that I've come across, even when I've been trying to research this academically, even when it purports to put forward something like that, often you find that there's actually the literature then devolves back into don't do this, don't do that, don't do the
Mm.
other, not
Mhm.
be this. And that, I
Mm.
think, is really tricky because there's no positive narrative to lift people up. I'm a
Mhm.
firm believer in lifting people up rather than putting people down. So
Mm.
that's where that kind of journey is at the moment. Sorry, it's a bit diffuse. I'm still working through it, but
No, I really agree with you. I really feel the same. I've been looking for the same definition too and been finding it difficult to find. We really need more healthy representations of how to be a man. So I'm going to ask you, how would you define healthy masculinity if you had to right now? What should men do?
yeah, I think there's a couple of things that are firmly masculine traits.
Mm.
And I want to sort of like put a little bit of a disconnect here. What I'm going to be talking about is expressions of masculinity. Now, that doesn't need to be and shouldn't be confined to cis men. What I want to
Right.
talk about here is like a representation of the masculine as opposed to the feminine, and identify those as sort of. I don't even think a linear spectrum is really useful here.
Hmm.
I'm sorry, I'm now dropping into an academic
Oh,
mindset a little bit.
go for it.
But if we're thinking about like traits and patterns of behavior and things that are positively masculine,
Mm.
I know a lot of women, self-identifying women, and non-binaries with more, maybe even a assigned female at birth, but uh, nevertheless non-binary identifying individuals who inhabit masculine spaces and have some of these qualities, as well as men that do. And I know men who are heterosexual and cis, but still inhabit more feminine spaces. So there's
Hmm.
disconnect between the gender and the sex for a second. But
Yep.
I think the key elements of masculinity that pop up again and again for me personally, and I do see sort of talk when I'm talking to my male friends about this or my masculine friends about this, is the capacity to provide shelter and care. And
Hmm.
by that I don't mean necessarily being the breadwinner. And my domestic relationship, my nesting relationship, this is an interesting discussion we're having at the moment where I find that some of the struggles and financial struggles of sharing things over the next 5 to 10 years is something that my nesting partner is in a better capacity and a better profession to cover those elements of financial cost.
Hmm.
Nevertheless, I would say that in many aspects of the day to day, I take on a higher percentage of sort of certain types of caregiving and provision,
Hmm.
particularly in the specifics of this would be things like food, planning, cooking. My partner is wonderfully skilled in many things, but is not skilled in the kitchen at all. Should be
Hmm.
kept away from knives because they're likely to hurt themselves, and they'd be the first to admit that. But certainly, caregiving or provision, I think, is a key element. Creating a protective and safe space as an expression of strength, I
Mm.
think is really, really important. I think too, and this is a really interesting concept as well that I've been playing with. I think there is something irrevocably connected between masculinity and violence. And that's something that's really a difficult and uncomfortable thing to talk about because I also look now more directly at my particularly sadistic side, but also just broadly the practice of BDSM generally, as an expression of consensual violence.
Mm.
Uh, in the same way as I would look at, so I'm also a martial arts practitioner, uh, and I look at, I've actually had to reframe my understanding of violence to inhabit that as well. When you walk into a dojo or you're sparring with someone, that you are training, practicing, and displaying violence. And I think there is something connected between masculinity and violence there that needs to be not just acknowledged, but deliberately shaped to a positive outlet.
Mm.
And martial arts and is a fantastic example of how one can do that. I think even if you look at some of the roughest sports, like I don't know if you've ever seen AFL's the easy one for Australians, but also if you've ever seen European handball played,
Hmm.
it's quite it can get quite rough and tumbly. So I think there is something quite masculine about violence as well. The question is, how do we shape these kinds of things in a way that creates that, like I said, that kind of positive script, that way where you are helping rather than hurting anyone in any of those kind of domains. And I think that the final thing for masculinity, for a positive script on, or a positive attribute to masculinity, or an element there, I think is this is the one I'm sort of struggling with the most. But there is a certain sort of assumption, I think, of a certain amount of power running through this. And this is something I'm still sort of trying to work out
Mm.
what that means, because it's not power over someone, but the relationships between providing care, strength, protection, violence, all of that sort of fits in a sort of power dynamic or power kind of bubble, if you like.
Hmm.
I'm just trying, that's the thing I think I'm struggling with being comfortable even talking about. And that's probably a good sort of segue too, because that's something I'm very comfortable talking about when I'm in a kink negotiation or
Mm.
in my nesting partner and I have a color dynamic as well. There's lots of spaces where I'm very comfortable talking about that. When I start connecting it to masculinity, You can probably hear it in my voice now. I'm starting to choose my words really carefully. I'm being very
Hmm.
toey, and it's not so much how it'll be perceived by your audience. That's actually an internal thing. I'm shying away from that part of myself
Mm.
because of the negative associations and all of the toxicity that is very well out there, very well recognized. How terrible outcomes these can be.
Hmm.
But I think there is still something there that is inherent, and it doesn't have to be bad. There are ways we can shape this in a positive way, but it's very hard to engage with it when you're shying away from it. You know what I mean?
Mm. So why do you think more people aren't talking about the positive elements of masculinity? Is it because there's been such a focus on the toxic elements that people are just scared it's going to turn into that conversation? Or do you think there's something else at play here?
I think there's a couple of things at play.
Hmm.
I'd like to acknowledge that it is very difficult to raise this conversation in the uh, current environment. I think
Hmm.
I don't think that's deliberate. I think that's a consequence of the damage that men have done
Hmm.
over generations, and there's absolute that like it should always be raised in a way that does not step on the voices, particularly the voices of women who have been hurt,
Hmm.
which is, statistically speaking, most women in some way.
Hmm.
I I do think, however, though, it does make it harder because the entire discourse is primed for reactivity. If you are seeing, and because there have been a lot of bad faith actors or a lot of men trying to reclaim the old ways, if you like, or who inhabit or are uncomfortable with losing the toxic elements that they've nevertheless enjoyed some privilege from, there's a reactivity there that makes it very hard to speak up about these issues,
Hmm.
as particularly as a man. And as a queer man, like this month is two things. We're in June. It's two things. It's Pride Month, and it's also Men's Mental Health Month. And as a queer cis man, that's a really awkward space for me to inhabit because I feel like
Mm.
I've got so many things I want to talk about right now, and some of them I'm really comfy talking about. If I put on the rainbow bear for a second, that's easy. But if I want to put on sort of more of the grizzly bear mask, as I call it, that becomes a bit harder.
Mm.
And I feel like there is less space for that. I think the second element, though, is that much like it always needed more and more women at the table and women leading the change for feminism, I think that a narrative of positive masculinity has to come from men.
Of course. Yep, I
And
agree.
we're naturally taught not, well, not naturally, but sorry, we're socialized not to talk about our feelings.
Mm.
I think individually, a lot of men are unsettled or scared,
Hmm.
not necessarily in any sort of like, what are you scared about? But just, it's an unsettling time to try and think about these things.
Mm.
And we haven't been socialized from a young age to talk about these things. We've been socialized not to. So you're dealing with adult men, sometimes well into their 40s or 50s, trying to engage with these topics. And that there are not a lot of resources and not a lot of tools for them to do so. And they've never been shown how.
Mm.
And I think that makes it very hard.
Hmm.
I think that's an issue that I think needs a lot more airtime in the general discourse. I think there needs to be a lot more patience shown to men struggling with trying to find their way to talk about this because, even if you're looking at an archetypal 55-year-old bloke trying, who's always kind of dependent on these core basic scripts of heteronormativity, male breadwinner, male privilege, uh, trying to undo those and trying to find what he wants to be, he's also never had the tools to do so. So if he messes up, he's a first year apprentice to lean on some pretty big
Hmm.
tropes here. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's never done it before. So I think that's a big barrier alongside the fear of being called out or creating a combative discourse when you're trying to create a collaborative one. I think one of the biggest issues is that we don't have those tools. And even, I do have an academic training in sociology. I do have an academic background in dealing with uncomfortable topics. So I do have some of those skill sets. And, I wasn't necessarily, like I said earlier, wasn't necessarily raised with those deliberate inputs of don't talk about your feelings, men don't cry, all the rest of it.
Hmm.
And I still struggle with them. So I
Mm.
genuinely don't know how you can, except for putting your own voice out there as best you can and supporting the voices of those around you. I don't know how you can make a sort of more dramatic, widespread change. I think people are trying, and the conversations are starting to happen. But yeah, I think those are some of the big barriers, if you like.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I think speaking up about it and telling your story is one of the ways forward. So thank you for that and being so vulnerable as well.
Hmm. One of the reasons why I signed up.
Mhm. Now, one of the traditions on the podcast is exploring a quote with you. And today's quote is from Foucault, who was a French historian of ideas and a philosopher. And he's best known for his theory of knowledge and power. Now, he once wrote, "Pleasure and power do not cancel or turn back against one another. They seek out, overlap, and reinforce one another." I'd love to hear what this stirs in you. Do you feel that pleasure and power are overlapping and reinforcing of one another? And if so, how does this show up for you?
Absolutely.
Hmm.
I'm really glad you picked a Foucault quote.
Hmm.
I've got several of his books
Cool.
behind me on my bookshelf, and that's actually what I'm drawing on when I'm thinking about this myself.
Hmm.
Uh, I think I'd like to take a step back from that. And I'm going to be cheating a little bit because I'm familiar with the literature.
Cool.
Foucault's point about power is that it's not something that's held.
Mm.
Power is not a resource or solid object. It's expressed through action and reaction. So, and this is something that I think gels very, very well with conceptions of pleasure too, even if we're talking about self-pleasure or masturbation or self-joy even. It's stimulus and reaction to stimulus in the same way that I think Foucault's conception of power is action and reaction to action. It's in its expression. So when I'm looking at this particularly from a kink perspective, both pleasure and power for me are about the dynamic, the interplay that occurs between the people that are involved, whether it's one person, or two people, or three, or five, or whatever. It's not something that comes about as a result of someone being given the leash or given the riding crop or being collared or being being filleted or licked out or fucked or fucking. It's about the interplay of the people and the way in which those actions and reactions are being generated.
Hmm.
So to give an example of somewhere I see both power and pleasure intertwined is in uh, is in a scene. That scene, I can put a collar on my kitten, or I can put a collar on someone I've met and negotiated a play scene with. That collar is just a piece of leather and metal. At the end of the day, it's just a thing. What comes out of that, the ritual of collaring that me and my kitten have, that's quite specific. It's a protocol. It's followed very rigorously. The reaction of the submissive to having that physical reminder, but also the negotiation beforehand, and also having that reinforced through the play, whether that's through discipline or through expectation or through encouragement, and the broader interplay too of the negotiation, the consensual surrender of power, and giving into that pleasure, and then also the dominance seizure of it, their willingness to inhabit that space and issue commands or punishment or to take that surrender, to take that power and exercise it. That's the power itself, not the collar, not the
Mm.
whip, not anything else. And I think that's a really, if my advice, if this was to be like an advice piece to young homins coming up, is understand that it's an interplay. It is through action and reaction. It's not something you just get to hold
Mm.
as the dominant. It's not something that as a submissive you get to just give up.
Hmm.
It's through use, it's through play that an expression
Mm.
that we develop and receive those things. So in my mind and particularly in my sort of sexuality, I have a little line here from my own little notes for going into the sessions. Kink is sex.
Hmm.
And for me, I know a lot of people in the community will separate like impact from sexual play. For me, kink is sex. It doesn't have to be penetrative penis and vagina sex for it to be sex. Kink is sex. And I think that is kink is sex, pleasure is power, power is pleasure, I think that's how I what I would reflect on your on Foucault's quote there for you is that it's about expression, expression and action.
So, how would you say your relationship to power has shifted over time, whether that be in kink or in life or both?
Um, I'd say in terms of life, it's something I'm still struggling with. I don't know quite, and that's I think where what I'm working on in myself right now is trying to think about how I can do that. And a lot of the times I'm actually importing a lot of my practices from kink. Um, in terms of in the kink world, it's something I'm being much more deliberate about.
Hmm.
So whether that's thinking about structures of scenes, uh, more specifically, and how uh, me and whoever I'm playing with can create scenes that work to create that play of power between us, because that's going to be different for different people. Or whether it's thinking about the ways in which uh, as a BDSM practitioner, and I would use the term practitioner, but I note that your last guest, or the last guest I listened to, I don't know the order you're going to be releasing these recordings in, but Master Arcane talked about BDSM as art, and I found
Mm.
that really interesting. It's not something I'd necessarily think of in intuitively myself. I would say as a praxis rather than as an art form, and not necessarily exclusionary of either term, of course. But I'm thinking about the ways in which those you can create those kinds of that interplay of power more naturally in a scene through deliberate ritualization, specific negotiations of acts of service or acts of submission or acts of dominance. I think it's something I'm being much more deliberate about than I have been in the past. I think and I say deliberate about because I think, going back to the Foucault quote, the other point is power is everywhere.
Mm.
And this is something that Foucault talks about when he talks about society, when he talks about personal relationships. Uh, Power is always being expressed. There's always expressions and resistances to power in everyday life. Where my relationship to it, I think, has changed is as I've matured, particularly as a BDSM practitioner, is in being much more conscious and much more deliberate about it. I don't have any set answers about what that means or looks like yet, but incorporating it much increasingly more deliberately into what I'm doing and how I'm doing, how I'm playing, how I'm negotiating relationships, how I'm negotiating dynamics when that's appropriate, and being conscious too about the ways in which people might not want it expressed as well. People talk about uh, negotiating boundaries and what their soft limits are and what their hard limits are. I think it's very important to be conscious that the dynamic of a power exchange can also be one of those things that should be very deliberately negotiated, even if it seems a little bit sort of ephemeral or even hokey. Because I think, particularly if we're dealing with people who might, as a practitioner or on either side of the rope, as it were, being aware of how people's experiences might have led them to react to certain expressions or not, but
Hmm.
also where people naturally fall into things and when they can find a more dominant space or a more submissive space as well. I think being deliberate talking about what power means and what power exchange means, I think is really, really important. And that's something I've been pursuing more deliberately and more consciously, I think, in the past few years. So I think my relationship with power is changing, is becoming more conscious of it
Mm.
and being more focused on it as a central kind of element.
Mm. I love that. Now, one of the kinks that you mentioned that you love is electrical play. I don't think we've chatted much about electrical play yet on the podcast. Can you please describe what electrical play is for those who may not be familiar, what it is you love about it?
Electro play is really fun.
Hmm.
It's the I think that there is something very different about the sensation of electricity that is quite different to anything else on the market, as it were. Like, everyone has fallen down, and so they know what impact feels like, and the
Mm.
impact from a paddle or a flog or whatever else is going to be different. A lot of us, if we're older, have been spanked as a kid, so you kind of know what that looks like, and you have to have that awkward conversation with yourself about, like, okay, but now I do enjoy it. But you know what the sensation is. You've got some point of reference. Electricity, we don't have a lot, I think, in our daily lives, a lot of point of reference to what it feels like. And
Mm.
it also has a very specific taboo nature too, I think, because it's quite, if we think about electricity in terms of your household power supply, I'm in Australia, so that means 240 volt uh, and potentially, 5 to 10 amps, depending on the circuit. That's that's dangerous. This is going to cause you harm if you screw around with it territory. And so it has a taboo, dangerous overtone to it that I think makes it a bit more mystical or a bit more, yeah, it's taboo. It's not in the common practice. So I think those are the 2 points that attract me to it. It's an incredible sensation.
Mhm.
Uh, and I enjoy electrical play on myself. I also enjoy inflicting is probably the wrong word here, but giving electrical play to others as well. It can come in a couple of different forms. The kind of two versions of it, I suppose, and again, we're painting ends of a spectrum as always. The sort of soft sensation style. So people might be familiar with toys like the violet ones or the neon ones or the variety of those kinds of things. If you're not familiar with them, the best way I can describe it is if you imagine like those plasma balls that showed up in like novelty stores and things,
Mm.
but
Mhm.
it's also conductive. So it arcs through the glass and then it arcs outside the glass to you. That sensation normally is very adjustable and can be anything from a very faint tickle through to, at the highest level I can sustain, the best parallel I can actually give is like an electrical version of getting a tattoo.
Okay,
So that kind
interesting.
of red
Mhm.
hot kind of drag if it's sustained, um, but with that sparkly kind of zap of. If anyone's ever played with any of those static discharge toys, so if you've ever done physics at high school or uni, you've probably touched a Van de Graaff generator or had a static shock from a balloon rubbing on your hair, things like that. If you
Mhm.
combine that with a tattoo gun, that hot knife through skin feeling of a tattoo gun, that I think that's sort of for the wand style toys, the upper side of that. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you've got the more sadistic pain side, and that's that electro zap. Whether you're dealing with discharge style toys like you can get various e-stim products that go directly into your muscles with pads, or I had a friend that spent a evening with a butt plug with two contacts inside him, and his partner had the remote to push it whenever he wanted. I have a similar device that's like basically a pet shock collar with a remote that I'll use with consenting partners, and that is always a shock, a zap, which can be anywhere from surprising to quite painful and burny.
Mm.
But it's a burn and it's instant, and there can be, particularly when you're dealing with those remote style toys, there's also a heavy fear element because you don't necessarily know exactly when it's going to happen, but when the button's pushed, it happens immediately. As opposed to like if you think about a flogger or something else, you're tied up, you've got that anticipation, but you've got that rhythmic build up if you're doing a warm up session, or you can hear the dominant sort of cackling, or even just winding up for the swing. You have some level of time, even if it's only a few seconds, to prepare yourself. Whereas on the more painful, immediate kind of side of things, it can just be a hidden button push that no one knew was coming.
Mhm.
In fact, I was playing with that particular toy with a partner recently. It's something we're exploring and being very gentle with because she's quite scared of it. But in the post scene debrief, we're talking about it. She's like, "Yeah, look, the fear of you like pushing it into my skin and wiggling it around and going, ooh, am I going to push it? That was far worse than when you actually push the button.
Mhm.
And when I actually pushed the button, it was when all of that fear and all of that play had subsided, and I tried to create a situation where she'd almost forgotten where it was and what it was doing, and then just without warning, just a push, and she jumped. So that's a very like it has those kind of elements that I think mark it out quite differently to a lot of toys people play with.
Mhm.
But certainly the sparkly kind of electrical feeling, that zap, is unique to electrical toys, but I think more importantly, it's something that we don't see present in the community terribly often. And in our day-to-day lives, electricity is one of those things we are taught to avoid because it's dangerous. Do not touch it. Um, People don't have the level of knowledge necessarily to discern what in the day-to-day life what is safe and what is not safe when it comes to electricity. And so I think all of that kind of puts it in this kind of taboo otherworldly pocket. I think that's probably a little overhyped. I think it's far safer than people realize
Mm.
in the toys we play with, but because that's our daily experience, and we have no connection, unlike with impact or with restraint or with other things. There's no normalization outside of the kink space of some element of it that it becomes weird and otherworldly.
Hmm. Let's chat about sadism. Why do you think you are a sadist, and how would you describe your sadistic self?
I don't know why I'm a sadist, and
Mm.
this is interesting because um, I really value human connection. I really love caring for people. My sort of social focus is very much grounded in connectivity and community. Uh, in my in my day-to-day life, I would say I'm sort of a caveated pacifist. Uh, I don't have um, any kind of like cruelness, I don't think, to me in that way. And yet, when I inhabit a sexual space, I derive a lot of pleasure from predicament bondage, from people putting people in situations where they consensually, obviously, feel a heavy degree of pain, can be suffering. One of the things I'm working up to with a partner at the moment is a deliberate scene to leave them in tears is actually the negotiated goal, and we're finding out where their limits are and where my limits are and how we can create that situation for them consensually and safely. But yeah, I derive pleasure from I think from the sort of mindlessness, the sort of animalistic side of that intensity, I think is what attracts me the most. Whether that's expressed through restraint and pain, or whether that's expressed through what I call sexual sadism. So the sort of standard things there would either be orgasm torture or orgasm denial. Either way, it's sort of generating that again that same level of overstimulation and frustration that hopefully then puts someone more and more in a space where they just start to switch off more and more of their kind of conscious thought and just start reacting.
Hmm.
So I think it's that sort of primal animalistic kind of reductionism. I think is what attracts me to it,
Mm.
is being able to inhabit that space where I'm being just a bit more inhabiting a more primal space in myself. This ties into the bear archetype too, as well. I think, and that the person I'm playing with
Hmm.
is sort of stripped away of more and more of their conscious space and is more and more in just a reactive space, I think.
Mm. Now, since we're chatting about sadism, I want to dive into this a bit deeper with one of the other traditions on the podcast where we explore a research article together. So today's paper is called Rethinking Kink: Sadomasochism as Serious Leisure. And it's fascinating because it's based on the author's real and extensive ethnographic research in a public sadomasochism community. And after her experiences in that community, she framed sadomasochism as recreation. She argues that kink isn't just about momentary pleasure or release. She says it's a serious identity forming practice, like a lifestyle or vocation, something that grows with us, helps us find belonging, and gives meaning to our lives. I'm curious to hear your perspective on this idea. When do you think that kink shifted from being something playful or casual into something more integral, more like a way of life for you?
I think for me, I think it, yeah, I think this comes up to a sort of is it a lifestyle choice or is it innate?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think the it very rapidly became
Mm.
part of my an integral part of my identity because I was as I said before, like I was 18, 19, I was going to these bars. They became it
Mm,
became my community. It became my daily venue, my weekly venue, I should say. If you wanted to find me on a Friday or Saturday night, I was at the Kink Club,
mm,
uh, as opposed to local pub or bar or nightclub or whatever. And with that comes the community, comes the play, comes the practice. The question I have in my mind was, is this accessible to me because it was already an intrinsic part of my sexuality,
mm,
or is it something I was socialized into and then adopted?
mm,
Uh, I can't give you a straight answer on that one
mm,
because I think if I try and tease apart aspects of my sexuality, particularly attraction to those power dynamics and sadism, I'm inclined to think of those as more innate. I think that the authors there are definitely correct to say that it's very much more when we're looking at sadomasochism in particular. I think it's very much more. It's more than a hobby. It's edging towards that lifestyle because not just of the sexuality implications. I think those are very serious and worth thinking about. Are you kinky in the same way that you might be, or vanilla or whatever, in the
mm,
same way that you might be straight, bi, queer, gay, whatever? And I think that sexuality, we're becoming more and more aware, I think, that sexuality is more complicated and more innate, perhaps, than we realize, or that more elements are innate than we realize.
mm,
I think when it comes to S&M particularly, because what we're talking about there is often there's a higher proportion of stuff that I would term edge play in the S&M space than you might find in the kink space more broadly. And that requires a higher standard of care, a higher standard of knowledge to do safely and to do consensually and to do well. Skills can only be developed with time and practice, and probably familiar with the 10,000 hour rule. And we see within the community people starting up workshop spaces, sharing their skills, having discussions and debates online about practice, morality, ethics, negotiations. Your previous guest, who was Master, started with A. Had
Master
it goes before.
Arcane.
Okay,
Yep.
Master Arcane
Mm,
was deliberately setting up a school, a space to foster and encourage those discussions and to teach deliberately. So I think certainly when you have those elements as well, and that sort of requirement, I suppose, of a certain level of knowledge or skill set, that all takes time and participation in community as well.
mm,
And so that has to become lifestyle. I think for me, that's kind of given, though. What's more interesting in that element is I'm not sure about, I'm not familiar with the concept of serious leisure as the authors are using it in that paper, but if I was to think of it as being serious leisure as a core part of your life that you are pleasure seeking in and is relaxing and is innate. That I think is interesting. As is S&M an innate element of sexuality
mm,
or not? And that I find, yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure where I sit on it. I'm inclined to lean towards innate, or that there are more innate elements of it than perhaps might be otherwise expressed.
mm.
I know.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just sort of thinking through my relationships as well, and the ones that have always been the most comfortable, and the two partners that I have at the moment, there are expressions of S&M and power dynamics present in both relationships that have been actively negotiated, and they're the most comfortable relate aside from, I'm happy and the relationships are going well, so of course I'm bouncy and happy about them. But if I think about them as objectively as I can for a second, they're also the ones I'm most comfortable in, and I'm
Mm,
experiencing the most sort of in touch with my sexuality with, and a huge part of that is through those elements.
because you're
Which
being
then again,
authentic.
yeah,
Mm,
yeah, because I'm being authentic, and I think that if you're saying you're being authentic about it, that does seem to imply that there is something innate in there, right?
yes,
It's
it
not just a
does.
choice.
Mm, Now, as part of our conversation today, I asked you to bring along something to share, such as a quote, book, or a movie that's influenced your sexuality. Can you share with us what you've brought along today, Bear, and how it shaped your understanding of your erotic realm?
Uh, I think I think what I'd like to share in that space is not so much a book or a movie,
Hmm.
um, because that's not something I've had a lot of time to pursue as much as I'd like to more recently. So I don't have anything immediately to mind that I can draw on there. But what I'd like to share instead is sort of an experience of community. I think
Cool.
the most important thing that's been present in my life, and when it's been absent, been most noted, most impactful, is being present in a kink community has probably been the most influential. Whether that's going out to the social events, whether that's been going out to, and in Melbourne, we've got a market coming up in a few months where a lot of people will be, selling their wares, things they make, talking about things, fashion shows, and all the rest of it, or those early formative experiences of mine in that lounge bar. I think those have been the most important moments. The human contact elements, the community elements have been the most important elements in my development and in my understanding of myself. There's a lot of great books out there that people can find. There's a lot of great movies and things. There's also some less good ones uh, out and about. But I think for me that the most important element has been actually active participation
Hmm.
and the community that's shaped by groups of people coming together and participating. I don't know if that seems like an easy out or not,
No, not at all. It's great advice. Yeah, really
but
good advice.
yeah,
Hmm.
that's definitely been the biggest influence I think on myself.
Now, before we dive into the next question, we have another tradition on the podcast where I ask you, the guest, a question sourced by the listeners. And today's listener question is specifically for a dominant. What do you think is the hardest part about dominance? And what advice do you have for someone to work through this aspect?
I think the hardest part, I think the hardest part of genuine dominance is developing the comfort to sink into it.
Mm.
And by that, I don't mean just because I see a lot of, and I see this with a lot of young male tops, particularly, um, acting almost on impulse or thinking they've seen something in porn or they've seen something someone else is doing and they're trying it on. And,
Hmm.
like a lot of people develop, it's another thing of young people developing an identity to a certain extent. Then I think that for most dominants, regardless of gender, there's a lot of responsibility. And Master Arcane talked about this a lot, right? There's a lot of responsibility that comes with being on that side of the whip. You need to be understanding of the nonverbal cues of the people you're playing with. You need to be active in your consent negotiations. I would say even though submissives absolutely should be active in their consent negotiations too and should be mindful of the dominant's consent, I think just by virtue of being the one to hold the implement, you naturally have a higher level, a higher duty of care, a higher responsibility in that situation because you're the one holding the thing, doing the thing. That what that can get in the way of, and what can be really, really challenging, is amongst all of that, finding the comfort, finding the sense of safety and sense of self to nevertheless inhabit that dominant space,
Hmm.
to take what is being given and use it. And this actually, if we hadn't already mentioned it, would be where I would be name dropping Foucault. That power is only going to exist insofar as it is used. So if you don't find comfort and safety and confidence expressing power and domination, how are you dominating someone?
Mm.
And this is distinct from an impact scene. And this is where I'd split between being an impact top or doing impact play and being dominant, because you can negotiate and say, well, we'll do 5 strokes of every toy. These toys, we won't use those toys. We'll do them this hard, and let's do some calibration. That too hard, that too soft, right? So there's the Goldilocks zone. We'll just do 5 of those. Da, 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 da. That's, yes, you can do that, and that can be a lot of fun. There's no reason not to enjoy that. Inhabiting dominance, I think, is that the hardest part of that is actually finding the comfort to trust in your negotiation skills, to trust in the negotiation you're receiving, and to be comfortable exercising it. That's, I
Mm.
think, really, really tricky.
Mm.
It's You need to lean harder into your negotiation skills. You need to make sure you're on the ball with those. You need to be comfortable with the fact that mistakes are going to happen, uh, and that you need to be confident in the communications you receive as well. I think the biggest piece of advice I would give to anyone, particularly if they're starting out on this journey as a dominant, is don't play with submissives you don't trust the communication of. Because if
Mm-hmm.
you can't trust their communication, if you're, and that doesn't mean that they're untrustworthy either. It might not be that you just don't have the connection or you haven't developed that level of communication yet. But it's not, there are dodgy submissives out there. It's a, can, are you relying on it? Are you comfortable in accepting that communication and trusting in it completely? Or as completely as you can in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
If
Great
you
advice.
need to be, yeah, you need to be mindful of that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the hardest thing, I think. And
Mm.
that's been a realization of the last 3 years too, I think. For me, it's
Mm.
been quite late in many respects.
Now, you've been part of both the swinger and kink scenes. What do you think each space gets right, and what could they learn from each other?
Yeah, this is really interesting. I heard a term the other day, of swally, which my partners hate, as being a swinger and poly, and then you've
Oh,
got kink
okay.
overtones there as
Never heard
well.
of it.
Uh, Look, it was an off the line comment from a video, and I haven't heard anyone who likes it, and I'm only, this is again sadistic site coming out. I'm liking the expressions my partners have when I use the term, because it generates a little bit of disgust and discomfort, more than I'm liking it for myself. I think so. I think consent culture is really a big part of this, and practice. One of the things that I think the kink scene does better than the swinger scene is proactive consent negotiations and knowing what that means.
Mm.
Because of the other kinds of play we do, and the way that it can incorporate physical force and violence, the way it can incorporate pain, the way it can incorporate restraint and power exchange, all of those things have a much higher duty of care for the people involved to practice consent. And so the consent culture, not that everyone is this way, there's a lot of, dodgy practices, there's a lot of people still learning and what have you, but the overarching consent culture in kink, I think, is far more present than in the swingers scene. And the way I describe that is, in kink, the expectation is that you negotiate everything, and that if things are not negotiated, they're not happening. Whereas in the swinger scene, I think there is a general culture of, may I join? That there's an underlying assumption that things are going on, and that it's not quite an opt out, but it's a little bit more than an opt in.
Mm.
Whereas in kink, the assumption is you've opted out until you opt in.
Right.
Where I think and I see this particularly in public events around my local community at the moment, where because of legislation, particularly, there's been a traditional separation between sex and kink. Uh, there's a lot of events that are like, oh, well, it's kink, but not sex. And then this can be manifested in a couple of different ways. You can have events that have restrictions on what kinds of sexual practices you can be involved in, and sometimes they can be a bit strange. Like, one particular rule I saw was no PIV, that's fine, but no oral penetration. But then cunnilingus wasn't considered oral penetration, which created this weird dynamic of
Right.
basically who could have sex and who couldn't, and
Mm-hmm.
how.
Mm.
And like I said earlier, for me, kink is sex. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't You don't have to be actively fucking for it to be sex. And I think the swinger space is because there's been a lot of, particularly where I live, there's been a lot of cross-pollination between the two as the legislation's changed and swingers venues have become more and more prevalent, um, and the kinksters have started going to them. I think that the swinger space gets a lot, has a better understanding and a better flexibility to allow or to encourage and foster kink in their sexy spaces. I think the kink community could perhaps get off their moral high horse on sexual penetration and sex a little bit, and maybe be a bit more flexible. That some of us do actually blend sex and kink in a variety of different ways, not exclusively penis and vagina or penetrative sex, but also inclusive of penetrative sex, and that maybe some of us don't have those distinctions in our minds when we're playing. So I think those are the two elements that they get quite right,
Mhm.
where they differ, I should say. Yeah, I think that probably answers your question. If it doesn't, feel free to chase me down on what I've missed.
Oh, I think it answers it very well. Thank you. It sounds like you've explored a lot, publicly and privately. Can you share with us a peak erotic experience that you've had, an experience that really sticks out to you from your erotic journey?
Um, I've got two.
Okay.
I think the scariest and kinkiest thing I've ever done,
Mm.
and this stands out as an incredible scene. I was in an ongoing negotiation online with someone that I'd never met. We developed a lot of, and this was explicitly and exclusively a play scene that we were negotiating. It was responding to someone's personal ad, and this wound up with the submissive showing up at a prearranged time outside my door, completely blindfolded, before they answered the door, before they knocked on the door, I should say. Uh, we'd negotiated the hard limits and the soft limits. We'd negotiated check-in points throughout the scene, but it was quite an open-ended scene. There was the part of the negotiation was we've got the check-ins and we've got the off-limit zones, so we can develop this as it goes. And
Hmm.
this individual had never seen me before, hadn't even heard my voice,
Right.
and got an hour into the scene before the blindfold came off and they knew even who they were playing with.
Wow.
And that was hot because the level of communication and trust to allow that to happen, but also like the erotic taboo and power that came from, again, talk about the dynamics of power play here, right?
Hmm.
I have someone giving themselves to me to play with, and they don't even know what I look like.
Mm.
And they're giving themselves up in a way that they've deliberately surrendered even their vision. That power play was really, really fucking hot. So that's one. I think the other one, and I'm very lucky and I get to relive this fairly regularly, and hopefully will be tomorrow morning as well. That's a very seminal kind of erotic part of my life is when I come in the morning and both of my when my other partner's been staying the night, and I get to see them both snuggling and cuddling up together in the morning, and they're
Oh,
both still
cute.
half asleep. It's kind of cute. I'm a bit of a romantic too, but it's also something that for me the polyamorous part, the non-monogamous part of my eroticism has been one that's been much more tersely negotiated in previous relationships and has often been a source of friction. Something we haven't talked about tonight today, but has been very much a part of my journey is the realization that I was not on that default script has
Mm.
caused a lot of friction in my previous relationships because if everyone else is wandering in, even if they're open to being non-monogamous, or even if they are identifying as non-monogamous or polyamorous, even most people I have met have had some sort of grounding and have consciously made the decision to step away from that, or have been offered a chance to step away from that, thought about it, and in the context of a new relationship, gone, well, if you're that way and I want this relationship, and you're saying that you're that way and you weren't like, you that's not something you're willing to give up even for a relationship. If the relationship's to continue, I will have to negotiate it in a way that I'm stepping off script. That's caused a lot of friction
Mm.
in various ways, and it's been positive friction, been negative friction. Probably don't have the time to cover that today, but uh, it is a really beautiful moment to see both my partners snuggling up together, to have that, to be sharing those kind of vulnerable, intimate moments in a way that they're both peaceful and comfortable. And again, because I have that dominant role in one of those relationships, the other relationship, we're talking about what that might mean, but we do kink and power play together on a scene basis. It's really nice to wander in and see my kitten and my partner snuggle up together, and it gives me a sort of lovely sense of sort of loving, romantic and sort of sexual satisfaction as well. Of my two people are there and snuggled up together, and the world hasn't even disturbed their sleep just yet. So those are the
Hmm.
two moments I think.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, you're welcome.
So, Bear, if you had to sum up your sexuality in just one word, what would that word be?
I think queer.
Hmm.
Queer is the label I'm most attracted to in that sense. I think queerness is one of those wonderful uh, kind of things that allows us to identify when our sexualities are outside of those standard scripts, when they're outside of those, we're outside of the mono heteronormative kind of structure when we're dealing with same-sex attraction or different conceptions of gender, when
Hmm.
we're dealing with kink and BDSM. I think queerness is a wonderful way of understanding and celebrating that, and of building and integrating community and culture into it as well, particularly consent culture and acceptance. So yeah, I would say queerness.
Hmm. Well, I'd like to thank you for being so open and sharing yourself with me and our listeners today, Bear.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you again. I'm Em, and this has been the Erotic Realm podcast. Thank you for listening to the Erotic Realm. If this episode stirred something in you, please take a moment to follow the show, leave a rating, or write a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It helps more people find the show and brings visibility to this deeper conversation about eroticism and self-understanding. I'd also like to invite you to dive deeper into the psychology of desire, including my writing, research, and upcoming courses over at psychologyofdesire.com. And if you want the full experience, join thousands of curious minds on my Substack at psychologyofdesire.substack.com, where I release the Psychology of Desire case files, behind-the-scene thoughts, and intimate reflections every week, plus more. Until next time, stay curious, stay embodied, and keep exploring. Also, as always, stay perverted.